There is a proverb in Ecclesiastes Kohelet 7:1 that comes across much better in Hebrew than it does in English. A good name is better than fine oil. You might be wondering, what does oil have to do with a good name, a good reputation? And is a good name only better than oil? What about something different? What about wine? What about silver? Is it better than gold? What's going on here? If we look at the Hebrew, we read, Tov Shem Mishemen Tov. And the word for name is Shem, and the word for oil is Shemen. This is a word play which connects the word name, Shem, with the word oil, Shemen. And now the verse is really easy to remember. Tov Shem Mishemen Tov. A good name is better than fine oil. And I actually remember my grandfather, who came to the US from Poland, he always used to tell me proverbs like this. The ones that were easiest to remember, Tov Shem Mishemen Tov. And if you think about it, we do similar things in English. It's not technically a proverb, but I just like to point out, I don't know much about Peter Piper. But I do know, and I've known for 30 plus years, that Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. This wordplay, the pun, the alliteration, is what makes this phrase really easy to remember. In 1894, Emanuel Kisanowitz published a list of 502 of these puns and wordplays in the Tanakh, that is the Hebrew Bible or Christian Old Testament. And since then, people have pointed out many, many more. To give you a good idea of how these puns work, I'm going to show you a number of puns from the book of Bereshit, the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible. But before I get there, I just want to make a shout out to the Super Torah Best Friends Study Group in the state of Oklahoma for sponsoring and dedicating this video. In Genesis 2:7 we find, And the Lord God formed the man with the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. In English, there's no pun here, there's no wordplay. But when we look at the Hebrew, we notice that the word for man is Adam, and it's immediately followed by the word for ground from which he came, Adamah. Man, Adam, comes from the ground, Adamah. And by the way, the name of the first man, this man, was actually Adam, Adam. This was a quick pun in one verse, self-contained. Let's take a look at another pun that actually lasts over 10 chapters. In Genesis 17:19, God tells Abraham, that he is going to have a child with his wife Sarah. And God tells Abraham that he should name the child Yitzchak, Isaac. Now, it's never made explicit, but the word Yitzchak actually means something like, and he will laugh, or possibly he laughed. No matter what, the root has to do with laughing. And now we can take a look at a few verses spread throughout the book of Genesis. In Genesis 17:17, we read that Abraham fell upon his face and laughed, Yitzchak. In Genesis 18:12, we learn that Sarah laughed, Titzchak. In the very next verse, we hear about Sarah's laughing, Tzachaka. And then in Genesis 21:9, we see Abraham's son, Yishmael, laughing, Mitzachek. And then finally, in Genesis 26:8, we actually have Yitzchak Mitzachek. Yitzchak was actually laughing with his wife, Rebecca. So while this doesn't really come across in the English, in the entire story of Yitzchak, there's this leitmotif of laughing, and that has some relation to the name Isaac, Yitzchak. Now these first two examples weren't too positive, they weren't too negative, but some of these can actually have a positive or negative tinge. For example, let's take a look at Genesis 19:36-7, which tells a story of the daughters of Lot having children with their own father, Lot. Thus were both the daughters of Lot with child by their father, and the firstborn bare a son and called his name Moab. And the name Moab sounds like Me'avihen, Me'av. The name Moab means from the father. And this is a jab at one of Israel's most hated, notorious enemies, the Moabites. And according to this pun, the Moabites got their name from incest. The first few examples were pretty straightforward, pretty easy to catch. But the next one, I didn't find out until a month ago when I posted a question on Reddit about biblical Hebrew. In the story of the twin brothers of Yaakov, Jacob, and Esau, Yaakov is running away from his brother Esau. Yaakov gets left alone at the Jabbok River, and he encounters a man who is either God himself or sent by God, and they wrestle. The Hebrew word for this wrestling is Avac, which only appears here, and we think it means something like to kick up dust, to wrestle. It's based on Aramaic. The Redditor Testate Amoeba pointed out that this root is used as a pun. Avac sounds like the name Yaakov. Yaakov Avac, Jacob wrestled, and it also sounds like the place name Yabok, the Jabbok River. And when you put it all together, you get something like the name of a boxing match. Instead of the Thrilla in Manila, we get Jacob's jab at the Jabbok. Now I want to show you just 3 more puns. They all come from Genesis. They all have to do with names, and they're pretty short, but each of them is unique in their own way. For the first one, I'd like to point to Genesis 3:20, which says that the man, who's Adam, named his wife Eve because she was the mother of all the living. And here the connection is made explicit in the Hebrew, where we see that the word for Chava, Eve, is similar to the word for life, Chai. So here we have an explicit etymology for this name. But many have suggested that there's a hidden etymology for the name Eve, Chava, and that is because in Aramaic, a language closely related to Hebrew, the word Chava actually means snake or serpent. And in case you're wondering, why would Eve be named a serpent or a snake? It's foreshadowing what's going to happen next, which is that the snake is going to convince Eve and then Adam to eat from the forbidden fruit and be kicked out of Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden. So if this pun is correct, and not everyone thinks it is, but if it is, this would be one of our more negative puns, like we saw with Moab being coming from my father, which is a negative thing. Alright, for the second to last pun, many of you know that I love biblical geography. I wrote a dissertation on biblical geography, and this one has to do with geography. Towards the end of the book of Genesis, Yaakov blesses his children, and there are many, many, many puns in the chapters 48 and 49. At the end of Genesis 48, we find, "And now I assign to you one portion, Shechem, more than your brothers, which I wrested from the Amorites with my sword and my bow." And here Yaakov, Jacob, is speaking to Yosef and his 2 sons, Ephraim and Menashe. And you might be wondering, what is that word Shechem there? What's going on there? Many people translate it as portion, but it literally means a shoulder. It just doesn't quite make so much sense. But if you know that in the region of Joseph, of Yosef, and Ephraim and Menashe, the largest city was the city of Shechem, and you can see it right on the map, then now you understand this geographical pun. Yaakov is saying, I gave you one portion, wink, Shechem, the great city, more than your brothers. It's a really important place in the history of ancient Israel. And finally, my last pun, and probably my favorite one, because it actually reminds me of that Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. If anything like that exists in the Tanakh, it is going to be this verse, is Genesis 49:19, where Yaakov tells his son God, he says, God shall be raided by raiders, but he shall raid at their heels. But if we read it in the Hebrew, it comes across as follows. Gad Gidud Yigudenu Vehu Yagud Akev. And if we kind of say that a few times fast, you kind of see how difficult it is. Gad Gidud Yigudenu Vehu Yagud Akev. So no matter what, even if it's meant to just help you memorize this verse better, these puns are there in the Bible, and if you read the Hebrew, you'll catch a lot of them either just by yourself, or you can find them in commentaries. But there are hundreds, if not thousands, of these alliterations, these puns, and these word plays in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible. If you want to study biblical Hebrew and learn to read the Bible yourself in Hebrew, you should know I'm teaching a class this summer at the Institute of Biblical Culture. You should come. It will be awesome. And if it's not now, you can come later on, because I'll be teaching courses there for the years to come. Thanks, and I hope to see you soon.